Hi, everyone. My name's Imran Valodia. I'm the director of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. I'd like to just kind of say how pleased we are to see you all here today. Kind of thank you for making the time to join us. So when we set up the Inequality Center kind of about 8 years ago, I think there were two things kind of that were important to us at the time. The first was that the argument that context kind of really matters, and the kind of the concern for us at the time that kind of issues of inequality kind of from the perspective of from the perspective of the global South, kind of in general, and from Africa in particular, were not sufficiently part of the international debate on inequality. And the second was that we kind of really wanted to share and kind of bring to the university and some of the best kind of thinkers and some of the best academics and policy makers who are work on kind of trying to address equality. Kind of probably agree with me is the most kind of important kind of global problem, kind of problem that we're dealing with. Very pleasing kind of today for us to have one of Africa's most kind of accomplished economists. His views on what the main drivers of inequality kind of on the continent, and his thoughts on kind of how you address the issue. So our DVC for kind of research and kind of innovation is going to say kind of a lot more about Professor Ernest Aryeetey, but kind of Prof. Aryeetey from the center side, kind of thank you so much for kind of honoring us and kind of agreeing to kind of to present the lecture today. So with those opening remarks, let me then pass it on to our DVC research, Prof. Morris, who's going to share some thoughts and then also introduce our guests.
Yes, so welcome to this annual Inequality Lecture. And this series exists for one clear purpose, to bring leading thinkers to Johannesburg, to Wits, to share the latest research and practice shaping inequality debates worldwide. And my warm thanks to Professor Imran Valodia and the SCIS team for convening this series, which is now in its 7th year, and for their leadership in building rigorous, policy-relevant scholarship on inequality. So tonight's conversation sits squarely in Africa's demographic present and future. Ours is the world's youngest continent. In sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 70% of people are under the age of 30. And by the end of this century, Africa is projected to be home to over 1 billion young people, which is nearly half of the world's youth. And by 2035, more young Africans will enter the workforce each year than in the rest of the world combined. Harnessed well, through investment in education, technology, entrepreneurship, and good governance, this youth wave could power inclusive growth and innovation. But mismanaged, it will amplify pressures on jobs, on services, and on social cohesion. So these choices play out against stark inequality, and Pan-African data show the top 10% capture about 50% of income, while the bottom half receive roughly 9%. And of course, as we all know, South Africa remains amongst the most unequal countries globally. A reminder that growth without equity is neither sustainable nor just. Legacies of colonialism, the structure of resource-dependent economies, and policy choices have all shaped today's disparities. And inequality is gendered too. A recent analysis found men in Africa earn roughly 3 times more wealth than women, the widest gender wealth gap of any region, underscoring why strategies for inclusive growth must center on women and girls. And these are the facts that drive our research, because inequality in Africa is structural and multidimensional, and solutions must be grounded in evidence, generated by African scholars working in African institutions and connected across borders. So the Center for Inequality Studies here at WITS exemplifies this approach, convening interdisciplinary teams, partnering with global data initiatives, and producing work that shapes policy debates. From the national minimum wage process to serious proposals on taxing extreme wealth. This is how research becomes reform. Better data on incomes and wealth, sharper diagnostics of market power and labor markets, and a pipeline of policy options that can be tested, implemented, and refined. So Pan-African collaborations are also essential here. The African Research Universities Alliance, or ARUA, which Prof. Aryeetey helped to establish and to lead, now connects more than 20 research-intensive universities through thematic centers of excellence, building capacity for joint doctoral training and collaborative research on precisely these issues. So it's therefore a particular honor to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Ernest Aryeetey, one of Africa's most respected development economists. His research on informal finance, financial inclusion, and the political economy of reform have informed policy across the continent. But before I do the official introduction, I'd like to add a personal note to say, Ernest, how delightful it is to have you back here at WITS. The last time you were here was to receive an honorary doctorate in commerce. But of course, you and I met well before then at an ARUA meeting in Ghana, where Ernest was well known for wearing very bright, colorful shirts. And I said to him today, I was very disappointed that he didn't carry that tradition, but he said he's dressed up for WITS. But I hope you keep coming to visit us, Ernest. So Ernest Aryeetey is an emeritus professor of development economics at the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, or ISA, at the University of Ghana. Until July 2024, he was the Secretary General of the African Research Universities Alliance, ARUA, a network of African flagship universities. He is a former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana and was also previously Director of ISA. Ernest Aryeetey was the first Director of the Africa Growth Initiative of Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. And he's held academic appointments at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, SOAS, at Yale University, at Swarthmore College in the US, and at various points in time. Ernest was a member of the Governing Council of the United Nations University from 2016 to 2019, and was also previously chairman of the advisory board of the UNU World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki. He is currently the board chairman of the African Economic Research Consortium. He was, until December 2021, the board chairman of Stanbic Bank Ghana Limited. He holds honorary degrees from the University of Sussex in the UK, Lund University in Sweden, Stellenbosch, the University of Ghana, the University of Health and Applied Sciences in Ghana, the University of Glasgow, and most importantly, the University of the Witwatersrand. Ernest's strategic priorities as Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana was to develop the university into a research-intensive institution that supports structural transformation in Africa. As ARUA Secretary General, his major preoccupation was to show that collaboration was key in making African universities more competitive globally, while remaining relevant to their communities. Ernest, there's no doubt that you achieved that. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ernest Aryeetey to explore why Africa remains one of the world's most unequal regions, and crucially, what must be done next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for the very, very warm introduction to WITS once again. The past 9 years, WITS has always become a home to me. Thanks to people like you, thanks to Adam, thanks to Zebulon, and thanks to Imran for all the warmth you've showed me and making me always feel very much at ease here. So I'm glad to be here. Imran, thank you for inviting me. As you very well know, having retired, I was looking forward to spending time playing with my grandchildren. But now people like you every now and again force me to believe that I'm still an academic and having to write papers. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. Today, I plan to talk about the changing dynamics of inequality in Africa. There are three main messages that I would like to project. Um, Everybody knows that inequality in Africa is big. It has been big for many, many years. And governments have been doing all they can to change the situation. But unfortunately, we've seen an approach that simply it's incremental, adds on to whatever exists there, and that does not deal with the structural issues as Lynn mentioned in her introduction. Clearly, this is insufficient if we want to overcome these entrenched inequalities. So that's the first message I want to make, that it's not as if governments don't know or academics don't know about inequality. We know about it, but the approach is fairly standard, fairly routine, and simply incremental. So we do something this year, next year we add on to it without dealing with all the underlying issues. Then we talk about the changing dynamics with time. I mean, there are things that have become even more important to our understanding of inequality, but has not received much attention in the literature. So I want to use this to highlight these. I'll talk about migration and climate change. I'll talk about technology, and then I talk about things like how we apply these, and then the political culture. The political culture that separates people, the poor and the non-poor, in an even more intense manner in the last decade than has been the case before. So finally, I would say, look, we got to make an argument for a very bold way of dealing with it. We've got to transform. Without transforming these economies in a very much more fundamental way, it's going to be extremely difficult to. So the incremental reforms that we're pursuing won't do it for us. We've got to be a lot more bold in what we seek to achieve, investing in public goods, not just any public good, but those that are likely to benefit the poorer sections of our society. Making sure that, I mean, today in Africa, and I'll be making that point again, social protection has become a major part of government's programs, but they don't yield the kind of outcomes that governments expect. And so we want to look into all of those things. So I begin with the introduction, and then I will talk about inequality trends in Africa. I'll move on to look at the various obstacles that we've seen over the years, and then how African governments are dealing with these. I will talk about the changing dynamics of inequality, and I will address inequality more comprehensively. That's why I introduced these four things that I mentioned, and then conclude from there. So by way of the introduction, and this is something that Lynn already mentioned, see, despite significant progress many African countries have made with economic growth and poverty reduction, there's still a lot of inequality. In the last 2 decades, Africa grew much faster than many other developing regions of the world. Unfortunately, that growth, which came from some reforms and the changes in the global economy, that growth did not see a more equal distribution of the outcomes. And that's a point that we make. So take a country like mine, Ghana. Ghana was one of the fastest growing economies between 1990 and 2010. And we were able to reduce poverty. We were able to halve poverty in that period. but also inequality worsened. And it's like that in many countries. There are some that have, a few that have seen inequality go down, and at the same time that poverty is going down. There are quite a few that have seen both inequality and poverty go down, and then a few that have seen inequality, poverty go up over the period. So Africa is quite a diverse mix of experiences, and we talk about the fact that this inequality has been shaped by quite a number of different factors. In many countries, what kind of education you receive will determine what kind of person you become later. There are a few countries where it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but it is in many, many places. Healthcare is a very fundamental thing for most of us, but it's not for many other people. Jobs, having access to jobs. I talk about Africa growing much faster. The interesting thing about African growth in those 2 decades is the fact that it seldom, in many places, yielded any new jobs. Growth, economies were growing, likely because the governments were spending more and more, but those expenditures very, very seldom led to new jobs. And so whether you have a job or not have a job is going to be very, very important. And the type of job that you get is going to be a key factor in determining where you are placed in the spectrum. And then we talk about the weak redistribution, and then the social protection policies, and finally, the political dynamics that perpetuate exclusion, how we use politics today to deny people access to various services, and so on. And I will talk also about the disparity, the gaps, mixing of the fact that for many, many of our places, it is historical. South Africa is a very good example of that. In many of colonial Africa, colonialism basically gave birth to the inequality that we talk about today. Then we will talk about the fact that growth alone, without any deliberate and inclusive policy interventions, will not deliver, as the point I've made already. We will discuss what governments have been doing. We will discuss what international bodies, the African Union and others have been doing, various partners putting pressure on African governments to do more than they are doing, something that we'll also talk about. And then we talk about some of the priorities that African governments have put in place or pursued, and what kind of results they got from them. It's interesting that we are all been talking about the SDGs for a long time, and the strong interest in ensuring that poverty reduction becomes a part of the norms of our countries. It's very important, and we'll look at how this is playing out. And then I'll talk about what I see as the changing dynamics that I've mentioned already. Migration is key. I'll talk about climate change, very important, especially for agriculture. I'll talk about access to new technologies, how the access to new technology determine what kind of jobs people will have or not have, and so on. And then the new political culture that I mentioned. We'll talk also about the kind of challenges that African governments have been dealing with, and what it will take to see this. So let me begin with the inequality trends in Africa. The important point that you see from this table, and I'll summarize it a bit later, is the fact that for several decades, we haven't seen much change. We haven't seen much change in income inequality for the top 10%. We haven't seen any change for the bottom 50%. We haven't seen any change for the top 1%. When it goes to wealth inequality, I will talk about what the top 10% are getting, what the bottom 50% are getting, and what the top 1% is getting. Clearly, just looking at this casually, we've seen over the years not much is changing, despite the interest, despite all the things that governments are doing. Here we use the various indicators of poverty, the Gini, to show that things are worsening in many places. And then, so here we provide enough evidence about the per capita GDP over the period, the growth that has taken place over there, which is important. The per capita national income the growth taking place over there is important, but the fact that a lot of that growth is going to a select few is important. Len mentioned the generalized version of inequality is important. It's driven by a type of jobs that women have. And the fact that their share of income from labor has not changed much is important over the period. So inequality remains structural and entrenched despite mild shifts. The top 10%, their share of income is about 57.1%. The bottom 50%, that's the majority, we've seen modest improvement in what they get. The top 1%, their situation is virtually unchanged in the period that we are looking at. When we go to the wealth, so it's also the same picture. The top 10% share is only seen a very small decrease there. For the bottom 50%, the majority, sometimes negative. And a good example of that is in South Africa. And then for the top 1%, we've seen that there've been some shift, moving from 36% in the mid-1990s to 33%. So these are the important thing is that not much is changing. That is where changes occur. They affect only small sections of the society. These indicators of wealth basically tell the same story. From basically giving from sub-region to sub-region, Middle East, East Africa, Middle of Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, West Africa, South Africa. So we give you the breakdown, the share that is going to various income groups or classes, and how this is distributed across the entire region. A very similar picture in terms of inequality from year to year, and then look at East Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, West Africa, then South Africa. The most important thing is that these figures show that whatever changes we are observing are not significant. Whatever changes we are observing are not significant. So we can say quite clearly that a tiny elite, top 1%, own almost everything. And then the majority, the poor people, are left out. That's looking at income, looking at wealth, looking at land, looking at any other opportunities. So that is clear. The distribution, the shape of it shows quite clearly some skewness in favor of the top income earners. Inequality is not just a statistic. That's an important point for me. It's a lived experience. It's something that people live through every day. We go through villages in various parts of Ghana or Nigeria or in Uganda, and you can see stark differences in terms of houses that you will find. And I will explain later when we discuss migration, how those lived experiences may or may not change, depending on how, So it's not just a statistic that we throw out there, but people live it, whether they are women, whether they are young people, whether they are in rural areas, whether they live in conflict zones. It determines how much access they have to education. And being able to go to a good school, being able to receive good education in Africa, clearly is very, very important. I talk about good because I will later mention the fact that many governments are making the effort to increase access, but not making much effort to improve on the quality. And so the ability of a young African to compete within the country, within the region, internationally, is becoming more and more difficult to deal with. So they made the point that incremental policy changes haven't moved the needle enough. We need to move beyond the half-hearted measures. We need to think about having a commitment to structural transformation. Almost every African country that I know, when they prepare the annual budgets and also the national development plans and programs that they have, do emphasize structural transformation. And yet, when you look at the substance of these documents, there's very little there that indicates a strong need, a strong desire to change the structures of those economies. So that's one thing that we need to reflect on. Then we talk about the changing dynamics of inequality in Africa. What I mean here is the fact that for each of these variables that we look at, the way it functioned under in the colonial era has seen some change, but not much in the post-independence era and also in the more recent times. So when you talk about the colonial legacy, where under the colonial governments, everybody focused on access to the various things that were exported, largely extractives. So in many of those economies, whether it's what is the Gold Coast, now Ghana, whether it's Nigeria or Sierra Leone, the non-poor were basically those who were involved in the extractive industries or involved in commerce. So if you lived in the Gold Coast and had a contract with Unilever or UAC in those days, the likelihood of you becoming poor was very, very low. But how many people could have such contracts with Unilever? So a very sharp distinction ensues from these kinds of relationships. When African governments started getting their independence from the early 1960s or late 1950s, everybody thought, oh, well, with the European gone, everything is going to change. Nothing changed. Nothing changed. In many places, the state simply replaced the European entrepreneur, and the state did exactly what the European entrepreneur used to do. So we didn't see much change there. Today, we also know that the extractives remain extremely important to your average African economy. So that's something that whether it's cocoa, gold in Ghana, or diamonds in Sierra Leone, or copper in Zambia, it's the same. This picture hasn't changed much. Oh, sorry. When we talk about structural transformation, the fact that many of these economies are simply dominated by the extractives, and not much has changed in terms of manufacturing. One of the things about manufacturing today is the fact that as a result of developments in places like Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, the belief that African governments are not advised to pursue manufacturing is one that is very much present in the literature today. But the question is, how are you going to create jobs for the large number of growing young people if you're not going to do manufacturing? It's more for me, what type of manufacturing you want to do. It's not because it's the only way you can create large numbers of jobs for people who are coming out of school. It's not going to happen in agriculture. It's not going to happen in the services immediately. And so that's something that we need to think about. How do we ensure that our dependence on natural resources is minimized? Healthcare access. In the good old days, in the colonial era, there was a very stark divide. Medical services were provided in large cities. If you lived in a rural part of any country, your best bet for getting healthcare was to go to the regional capital or the national capital to look for it. Not much changed. We saw an expansion in Ghana. We used to have only the regional hospitals. Through the 60s and 70s, we built district hospitals. But even for these, the average resident in Ghana will have to cover at least 30 kilometers daily on a regular basis to access healthcare. That hasn't changed much. That hasn't changed much today. So, talk about weak social protection policies. In the colonial era, there were no such policies. With independence, there were introductions of small programs largely focused on pensions and subsidies. Today, they are more expensive or more expansive services provided under social protection, but there are gaps in quality and also convergence. So this is an important point. If you come to a place like Ghana, we talk about the school feeding program. We talk about the livelihoods enhancement against poverty. There are several programs that government has put in place. Today, many of these have been politicized. So who gets access to a LEAP grant It depends on which political party you support and which government is in power. So how do you use social protection effectively if it is dominated by politics? That's something that we need to think about. Taxation, we talk about it. We haven't used taxation meaningfully, effectively, to redistribute whatever resources that we have, whatever incomes are available. We haven't done that. So I've just talked about the expanded social protection programs. Conditional cash transfers are very well known in this country. Broad safety nets, including access to national health insurance, growing in many countries in Africa, but limited in scope. So many Ghanaians will tell you that yes, they have national insurance, but the things that take them to the hospital are not covered under the insurance. So that's the kind of situation that we have. So this basically tries to summarize the challenges to inequality reduction that we face, how we've struggled to deal with the structural issues. We've seen what happened in the colonial era. We talked about the absence of things. We talked about the division, the wide divergence between rural and urban areas. Today, we still talk about the same things. So you take a place like Ghana. I keep bringing Ghana because first, I come from Ghana, so I know Ghana very well. But Ghana, in my view, represents everything that is good and very bad about Africa. So you get the good things that you look for in Africa, you find them there. And the bad things that you wish nobody would try them, you also find them there. So from the colonial period, the divide between northern and southern Ghana was huge. Why was that huge? Because the resources to be exported were in the south. Cocoa, diamonds, manganese, bauxite, gold, they were all in the south. And so the railway infrastructure was provided to support that. The road network was provided to support. The schooling system, the health system was all designed to favor the south. Today, we try to make amends by doing things in the north. But we don't plan it properly. We don't plan our provision of social infrastructure in northern Ghana with economic infrastructure, economic development. And so we bring up schemes that quickly are captured by the new political elite of the north. So you are spending more money than was happening in the colonial period, but you're not getting the results you're looking for. You are developing a new elite, fairly wealthy by Ghanaian terms, and yet the average poor person in northern Ghana is as poor as he was under British rule. That's the kind of story that we talk about in this year. So, talking about the challenges to inequality reduction, the first one I talk about is the unequal access to education. Imran, you have to keep me on time. I think, I don't know, how many more minutes do you have?
Just about time to talk.
$15 minutes, that's fine, okay. So I talk about the fact that despite increased primary school enrollment, there are stark disparities in the quality of education. Ghana has introduced what we call the free senior high school, which means every child of secondary school going age, so long as they are willing and interested in going to secondary school or senior high school, will find their place, which is good. It's good nominally. But because the state cannot afford it, it means that the type of education being offered by the school system has gone down. There are many teachers who feel quite left out because they are not well paid. They feel they'll be better paid in the private sector. The school kids are supposed to be receiving free food from the state, and the free food comes irregularly, and so on. School compounds are not well taken care of because there's no money to do it. So the desire to do good things for the poor is there, but the ability to do it has been compromised largely through poor politics. And so that's something that we talk about. So we talk about how these are leading to very limited mobility for those who get involved. Access to health services is similarly the same. And so you will find that you live in a district in Ghana where there's a hospital, there's a district hospital, and there are doctors with some limited experience, but they don't have the equipment that would allow them to diagnose various illnesses, diseases. The equipment is not there. The nurses there don't have the kind of skills that are required to manage many of the things there. So the urban and rural divide really continues. And then the gender thing that I mentioned earlier. Youth unemployment, underemployment are major obstacles. So many of the youth in Africa don't have the kind of skills that are required of them. We've already mentioned the absence of diversification in many places as a result of relying on these primary commodities, something that is very well known and that needs to, unless we address that, nothing is going to change much. There are the institutional weaknesses that we could talk about. Tax administration in many, many countries is quite limited, very limited in scope. There have been many initiatives over the years to improve tax administration. There have been many number of training programs put together by the World Bank, by the IMF and UNDP and other institutions to train African tax managers. But there's still a lot of challenge in many, many places, leading to a very ineffective income tax base. Coordination failures are important to talk about, and then the capacity of the state to do what it professes that it wants to do. Africa remains vulnerable to a complex array of external shocks, entrenched patronage and favoritism, exclusionary policy processes. One thing that people talk about all the time is corruption. Corruption as a way of dealing with the whatever progressive policies we may put in place, how corruption takes away the interesting things that we expect to come out of them. So if you live in many West African cities, you are paying for things that you don't have to pay for. You pay for things that are supposed to be provided by. I give you an example. So you put your son or daughter in a boarding school, which is supposed to be free, but because there isn't enough food, you go there and you pay the housemaster or the house mistress to look after your son or your daughter, and you spend a lot of money. You spend more money paying someone to take care of your son or daughter in the school than you otherwise would have. It's a very corrupt practice. So in many of these boarding schools, the wives of the teachers have become food vendors. The state can't do it, so they do it for the state and they charge. So it's nominally free, and yet kids are having to pay. What it means is that the kids that can afford it have an easier way through. I'll give you one example. I visited a girls' school in Cape Coast, Ghana, a girls' school, a very well-known girls' school. And it was dinner time, so my host took me to the dining hall for the girls, and I saw on a table, there were 5 girls. And these 5 girls, they're having what we call in Ghana kenke. It's a ball made from corn, what do you call pounded corn. And it's a very, very much liked. Somebody goes with fish and some spicy gravy, So I watched 4 of these girls eat their kenke with the gravy, what looked like a gravy, but no fish, which is very unusual for a Ghanaian kid. So I asked the teacher in charge, but why are these 4 girls eating their kenke without fish, and there's one eating her kenke with fish? So what kind of system allows one person to have fish and the other four not? And no. The one with the fish brought the fish from home. The other four, they didn't bring any fish. So they have to eat with it. Now, so you sit with your classmates, some have fish and others don't, because there are some whose parents can afford fish for them. What kind of society are you putting up? Are you developing? And what kind of kids are going to come out of this kind of system? And as I mentioned this to my friends, so but this is common. That's how they survive. So the wealthy are going to go through a public system full of advantage, and the non-wealthy, the poor, are going to go through that same system with all the disadvantages that go with it, and it's going to affect them later, definitely. And it's something that we know, but we fail to do anything about it. So we talk about the current attempts to, so here we talk about the efforts to try and every country in Africa is trying to do something on the tax front, right? To widen the tax net, change the base, so redirecting indirect taxes. All of these are taking place, and yet we don't see the results. Governments are expanding the social protection programs. I've talked about it. Targeted welfare schemes, I've mentioned quite a few. There's the examples that I gave in the paper are Senegal's Family Security Grant, South Africa's Child Support Grant, Ghana's LEAP, and so on, which I've sort of expanded on earlier. Targeted social investments, we have examples in health and education, vaccination, maternal care programs, and so on. These are things you will find in every African community. How effective are they? Varies from place to place, and how much is being put in them. Infrastructure for inclusion, building rural clinics, scholarships for disadvantaged. You find, the good thing about Africa today is when you listen to things that governments talk about, it's like everything that we want to do is going to be done. At least on paper, is going to be done. When it comes to the practice, you don't see much there happening. Empowering women and youth, formalizing informal work, and so on. These are some of the initiatives that you'll find in many places. Empowering marginalized groups through rights and protections. Land right reforms in Rwanda, for example, is something that has been used to improve a lot for women. Progressive labor laws. South Africa have been dealing with this for some time. Expanding social and financial inclusion. Financial inclusion has become very, very big in Africa, thanks to various initiatives that we've seen. It benefits those who have access to it. The intention has always been to grow it, and we've seen significant growth in financial inclusion. How it has changed livelihoods, how it has changed opportunities for people is another story completely, and that's something that we need to look at more effectively. There's a lot of regional and global collaboration through ECOWAS, the initiatives that they are taking to end hunger. The African Union and the Union initiatives also worthy examples to mention. There are also innovative policy solutions that many governments are talking about. For the first time in many African countries, you hear things about affirmative action laws intended to deal with the challenges and so on. It's working in some places, not so well in other places. Now, this is one area that I thought we should also spend a bit of time. So climate change, so here what I call the changing dynamics, the new areas. So all the things I've talked about previously are things that we've known about and are doing something about. These ones that I'm mentioning are those that have only recently become important, or more recently become important, and nobody is doing much about them. So I talk about climate change. The major area in which this is affecting production in Africa is in agriculture. So the type of agriculture that you do is very, very important. There are new, young, well-educated Africans moving into agriculture. There are not many of them, but it's a growing population. And they approach agriculture differently. They approach agriculture with climate change in mind. So irrigation is very important for them. But sustainable irrigation is what they are looking at. How do you do that on a sustainable basis for a growing population, a larger section population? How do you provide seeds to farmers that are able to withstand to all the challenges that come with the climate change? How do you ensure that the road network is able to survive despite the weather changes and so that are taking place? There are many, many things that are affecting African agriculture in a very, very significant way, but we haven't prepared for them, so we are powerless in dealing with them. The other thing I talk about is migration. Migration has become a major weapon in dealing with, 25% of all African households are dependent on remittances. 25% of all African households are dependent on remittances. So, if you live in an African town or village and you are dependent on agriculture, that's all the income you have, and your neighbor has a son who lives in South Africa and is able to send the equivalent of $100 home every month. It's a very big difference between your household and the next one. I remember about not quite 5 years ago, going to a funeral in a very small village in central region of Ghana. And as I stood there outside a church looking at towns, looking at buildings in this small town, I noticed how badly some looked and how well a few others looked. There was a chap standing next to me who was doing the same thing. And his remark was, there are so many houses here that are in very poor shape. Don't they travel? His question was, don't they travel? What he understood was that the houses that looked good had a son or daughter in Europe, North America, somewhere. And it's very telling. Remittances have become very, very important. So if you see people crossing the Sahara, crossing the Mediterranean, crossing the English Channel to get to, they are anxious to do as well as their neighbor. And that kind of inequality is a very big one that we've got to think about, not only as a nation, Ghana or South Africa or Burkina Faso. It's one that, as a globe, we've got to think about it. We've got to think of how do we reduce the strong desire or minimize that desire to leave Africa and go elsewhere. But of course, until we do that, until we create the incentive for them to remain here, it's not going to change much. And so when you go into any small town or village in Ghana or Nigeria and see houses there, the good ones, the bad ones, the only explanation you can find is migration and remittances. 25% of all households in Africa are so the other 75% may be doing something on their own, but a vast majority of them don't have it. And so they will be pushing their kids, their young men to get out. New technologies. Today, as a result of improvements in information communication technology, it's possible for even poor artisans, poor technicians in many countries to have access to financial services, to have access to education, to have access to health using digital means. But we also know that the provision of these services is very poorly coordinated in many places. So as a result of that, we create a new form of inequality. Those who know how to use the technologies, those who are able to stay at home and work for a company overseas, those who are able to use the technology to access education elsewhere, are having new advantages over their neighbors. How do we deal with that? It's something that we haven't thought about in a structured way in many places, but it's bringing a new form of inequality that needs to be considered. The final point about this one is the new political culture. The new political culture. What is it? Since the early 1990s, most African countries have pursued democracy. And democracy is nominally a good thing. It means simply that a political party wins elections, goes into power for 4 years, and then contests again. And if they are lucky, they come back for another 4 years, and so on. So we've seen governments change every 4 years or 8 years. We've seen that happen. But it's also come with it a culture that wasn't probably anticipated. That new political culture, that means that once you're in power, you can do whatever you like to maintain your position or maintain whatever advantages that you have. So everybody sees access to political power as the salvation to or the solution to their poverty. Every policy or most policies coming out of these new governments are intended to provide support to a distinct group, not everybody. So I give you an example again from Ghana. We still have what we call the District Assembly's Common Fund, which is a percentage of total GDP that is given to each of the districts that we have in Ghana. And the funds were supposed to be used by the assemblies to provide health, to provide education, to provide infrastructure, social infrastructure, and other things. MPs realized that the guys in charge of the use of their district assemblies common fund were more powerful because they control the resources. They lobbied to have the law changed, which gives the parliamentarians access to some of these funds. What it has led to is that if the parliamentarian is in charge of the funds that will bring health and education and roads and irrigation and so on, it means, in practice, that the roads and the schools will go to where he gets his votes from. And that is what is happening. So you go to a place and you're looking for access to or improvement of the road. So go and see the MP. But that's a new culture. So it's a culture that allows people with political power the authority to decide who gets what. So if you follow the politics, you stay away from poverty. If you can't have access to political power, then you remain poor. And it's not simply in Ghana. I've seen it in Nigeria, I've seen it in Uganda, I've seen it in Kenya. It's a culture that is, some might think it's quite reminiscent of pork barrel politics in the US. It's not. It's very different. It's a very, very different type of thing where, because of the large-scale poverty, because of the large-scale illiteracy and so on, it allows a small group of people to determine far too many things. And so I say that if we don't deal with these things, there will be chaos. So as I wrap up, I say inequality in Africa extends beyond income. It includes education, healthcare, technology, and the gender gaps. These are points that we've made over and over. Structural transformation is important for inclusion. It means we must diversify our economies, but we should be very effective in targeting those things that are likely to create jobs for young people. If it's agriculture, let's do agriculture. Let's do agriculture wisely. Let's do agriculture in a manner that it creates jobs. It creates large numbers of jobs, not simply bringing in a new political elite into agriculture. Let's be more progressive in how we pursue fiscal reforms and redistribution. How do we enhance or grow the informal sector? Most of our economies are informal, and many people in there don't pay the taxes, but there are some who can afford to pay taxes. How do we target properly those who can pay taxes and those who cannot pay and support them? We're talking about the need to tackle ethnic and spatial fragmentation. A part of this political culture, the new political culture that I mentioned, leads to ethnic and spatial fragmentation, where votes matter most in terms of numbers. And in many African countries, politics is all ethnic anyway. Everybody votes for the person that speaks their language or the person that comes from the area. So that new ethnic fragmentation is something that we need to think about. Technology and inequality, we talked about what it can be done there, making sure as many people as possible have access to digital means, how many people have access to the whatever financial inclusion schemes we have in place is very, very important in closing the gap. Social protection is important, but needs to be much better managed to ensure that you don't need to be the relative of a politician before you get access to any services, but it targets people who are in need and are done more effectively to ensure that kids that go to school don't go without fish because their parents can't afford fish. But every kid there has a fish. So inequality can be shaped by leadership, governance, and social norms. It's about time that African leaders began to walk the talk. They've been talking about social protection, they've been talking about reducing inequality, but very few of them actually do go the extra mile trying to do something that will bridge the gap between the poor and the non-poor. Systemic and economic policy reforms are important. We've seen that happen in many places, and we need to do that in a much better way. Strong institutions are important, and governance is very important. How do we take away corruption? How do we deal with corruption? Without dealing with corruption, many of the things that we want to do, like giving kids a good education and so on, will not happen. So we've got to deal with that. So I conclude by saying that Africa's inequality trap needs to be broken. Breaking free requires bold action, and that bold action is what we talked about. Leaders must believe in it. Leaders shouldn't think about giving social protection because it leads to votes. Leaders must think about doing social protection because it's the only way that you are going to bring into the job market young men and women who can or who have the skills to be able to do something more productively. Without bold systemic change, inequality will keep Africa's development on hold. Addressing these disparities is both a moral and economic imperative for Africa's future. That's something that I strongly believe, and I do hope that we can deal with it in that manner. Thank you very much.
Let me, before I open up for kind of Q&A, ask you to join me again in kind of thanking Prof. Aryeetey for covering such a wide canvas of issues over a very complicated kind of geographic space in kind of such a clear and concise way, and for offering us a bold kind of strategy in Africa for kind of addressing inequality, and also for kind of doing it in exactly the 45 minutes that we asked him to speak for. So thank you so much, Prof. Aryeetey. So kind of over supper last night that a few of us had with kind of Prof. Aryeetey, he kind of regaled us about kind of about an extremely prominent economist who shall remain nameless, who was asked to speak for 45 minutes and spoke for 4 hours. And because the chair was too scared to stop him, he just went on kind of on and on. So I was also too scared to stop you, but you stuck absolutely to the time. So thank you so much. So I think we can open it up for kind of any questions and any thoughts anyone wants to share. I think kind of Prof. Aryeetey and I will sit up here and we can take perhaps three questions. Perhaps three questions in the first round. Anyone kind of happy to go first?
One, two.
So we have Ruth there.
Okay. Greetings. I am Spelelengit. Thanks, Prof, for the amazing presentation. I would like to ask, in terms of the barriers, in terms of diversity of the African economic activity, which has limited us to commodity and etc. instead of manufacturing, would you say it's political will, or it's the continuous deals that we keep on making, be it the trade liberation deals to the Chinese deals that we currently have now? And also, in terms of social protection, currently in South Africa, there are talks of cutting down public spending. So in terms of social protection or things such as social grants and etc., what are we doing right and what are we doing incorrect in terms of ensuring that this create as much of upward mobility as possible? Or is it just we are doing things right, it's just the economies themselves are not able to pick up these people? And what is the role of the African university in this current state in addressing inequality, besides the idea of maybe consciousizing, but what is the role of a university based in Africa in addressing Africa's inequality problems beyond incorporating children from poor backgrounds?
Great, thank you for that, Spilele. So there were at least two questions there. So let's take one more from Ruth, and then Kara, you can respond.
Thanks so much, Prof. I wanted to touch on two other aspects and ask for your reflection on how they interact with each other and maybe with this broader range of challenges. The first being the public debt crises that so many African countries are facing, from Ghana to Mozambique, that seem to be both a product of an extractivist development model, governments entering into public-private partnerships, incurring debt in order to promote a particular kind of development, but then ultimately also undermine countries' development strategy. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit from your experience on this issue of public debt. How do we theorize it, and what do we do about it? And then secondly, in the current geopolitical context, the question of tariffs. And we're starting to see emerging research about the bloodbath that the imposition of U.S. tariffs has put, the jobs bloodbath that the imposition of U.S. tariffs has put on places like South Africa and so on. But obviously, there's a differentiated impact also across the African continent. So any thoughts you have on that? Thank you.
Great. Ernest, you want to deal with those?
Yeah, thank you very much. These are very interesting questions with not easy answers to give. So why can't we diversify? Oh, the first question. What are the real challenges we face in trying to diversify? You ask whether it is simply due to a lack of political will. I don't think so. As far as I know, for the last 60 years, every African government has prepared a development plan for 10 years, longer sometimes, and each of these has been devoted to diversification of the economy. The target has always been to add value to whatever exports that we are putting out there. In pursuing that, governments have had very different approaches, and they've come with different results. One good example, Ghana, again. Ghana began its post-independence experience with import substitution manufacturing. It didn't work because the state was the only entity pursuing the production of the items, whether they are in the electronics or they are in textiles and so on, all the factories were owned by the state. The state didn't take into account how it will empower the private sector to be a major actor in this endeavor. And you find different experiences. In Tanzania, it was very much along the similar lines. Zambia, very much the same. Kenya took a different approach, but as a result of various internal governance challenges, the outcomes have led to the other problems. So the absence of diversification, in my view, is the result of not pursuing clear strategies that would yield the kind of outcomes. Example that we often use in economics is Africa versus Southeast Asia. And I'm sure you've seen comparisons of Nigeria and Indonesia, Ghana and Malaysia in the literature quite often. And I was explaining to a Japanese student a couple of weeks ago that it isn't a case that Southeast Asia pursued right from the beginning, like Ghana or Nigeria, similar approaches to diversify the economies. The Southeast Asians, in the first decade, observed their challenges or observed whatever mistakes they were making and put in place from the 70s remedial measures. And that changed a lot. In Africa, we didn't put in place any remedial measures. We kept doing and doing and doing the same thing that we started from the 60s. If we got dissatisfied with you, we removed you. And we brought in a new set of actors who did the same thing, and then we removed them, and then a third group will come. That's what we have done. Southeast Asia learned their mistakes. Putting too much power in the hands of the state was not good. They saw that, and they changed it. They changed it in Malaysia, they changed it in Indonesia, they changed it in Thailand, they changed it in many places. The Koreans are their own league, but they made mistakes also and changed. Africa made mistakes and refused to be. So every year we add to what we have. We add a new thing to what we have, depending on what new ideas there are in development economics. But we haven't made that bold step that this is how we do manufacturing. Today, we live in a world where many development economists will tell you, as Africans, that look, trying to compete with China in manufacturing is a waste of time and effort because China is China and China controls the entire market. It's partly true. But I don't see the Africans talking about how are we going to do our own version of manufacturing. You need manufacturing to create jobs. So you have to do manufacturing. What type of manufacturing? I don't hear the African universities, I don't hear African policymakers discussing the future of manufacturing. So we sit there and we receive wisdom from outside. We sit there and we will be told what is good for development. We, the Africans, it's about time we did our homework. What kind of changes? We don't need to wait for someone to come from outside. Politicians know that they want to diversify, but they are afraid. They are afraid of taking those bold steps, and that's something that we need to overcome. And that being afraid to take the bold steps, I'll tie it to the question about a public debt. We borrow a lot, and in principle, there's nothing wrong with borrowing, so long as you know what you're going to use it for. I have watched African governments go to the private markets in Europe to borrow. And when interviewed by journalists about what the money is going to be used for, they've said, when we get home, we will decide. When we get home, we will decide. So you borrowed without a plan. You borrowed without thinking about returns from whatever investment. You borrowed without thinking about how are you going to pay back. You gave Ghana as an example. Ghana promised, I listened to my president talk about 5 years ago, this is the year of roads. This is the year of roads. We're going to put roads everywhere. Without thinking about what type of roads, which areas, how will the roads be linked to agriculture? How will the roads be linked to other infrastructure and so on? We spent a lot of money tarring for asphalt in places where nobody thought there was a need for it. So, of course, when our deficits began growing and we're financing it with lots and lots of borrowing, every economist knew that the bubble was going to burst very, very soon. And it did burst. It did burst. And when it did, it affected everybody, including the poor. The poor who didn't have access to those roads, they have to pay. They have to pay more taxes. They have to pay more taxes either on VAT or various other things. They have to pay for going to the hospital. They have to pay for going to basic schools. Today, Ghana spends less than 7% of education budget on basic schools because it can't afford to do more. And because it is spending all of its money paying interest on debt that didn't yield anything. There are hospitals that have been constructed and for 3-4 years can't open because they don't have enough doctors to run them. So we borrow, the public debt has grown. We borrow without thinking about using the new debt instruments to improve the lot for more people, using the debt to generate jobs, using the debt to improve the infrastructure that will sustain agriculture, that will support manufacturing. So we give the urban elite, where I live, where I live in Accra, let me been to my house so you know where I live, without any discussion, all the roads in my area were asphalted. Of course, it made me happy driving home on good roads. But every time I sit in my car and I drive on those roads, I say, who is paid for this? So that's the Africa we live in. The people outside of the capital city don't have those roads, but yet they have to pay for them. That's the problem that we. So I will never tell an African government don't borrow. I will say borrow wisely, borrow and make sure that whatever you are borrowing can sustain itself. That you don't need to kill people in hospitals and so on to be able to pay back. So the African public debt is huge. We got to think about how to avoid capital markets that are certainly not suited to our environment. So that's the. I don't know if tariffs. Of course, tariffs have become big thing for the world today, largely because of the US. And South Africa, I know that you have a major crisis on your hand. But I don't think this year, maybe I'm being more optimistic than I should be, I don't think it will last. I don't think it will survive. The policy won't survive. And even if it survived the next 4 years, even if it survived, I don't think African exports to the US are so big as to damage most economies. I may be a lot more optimistic than others are. I look at a country like Lesotho. Lesotho has been very big on agua, exporting textiles and the garments to the US. And I've seen how, as a result of the new tariffs and the collapse of agua, people in Lesotho are struggling. People are losing jobs as a result of that. So that's a real thing. That's a real experience with how these tariffs are going to destroy economies. Fortunately, not many African economies are in that situation. And so they can, most of the things we export are agricultural goods and minerals and so on. Minerals will always be in high demand everywhere. Your gold will always find a new market, and your gold will enjoy high prices. And they are doing so at the moment. So I'm not too worried about Donald Trump. So the Indians may suffer, the Europeans may suffer, depending on whether they are Spain or Portugal. They will suffer. Germany will suffer for its car export business and so on. But these are things maybe within the next 4 years they'll phase out.
Great. So we have possibly one. I was about to say one more round of questions. Let's start with you. So the three people that have the mics, let's go with you.
Thank you so much for robust and quite detailed lecture today.
I don't think the mic's on.
There we go.
Yeah.
Prof, thank you for a robust and really detailed lecture today. I got a little bit, not a little bit, a whole lot said when you were sharing the data and the statistics about how we've remained quite stagnant since 1980. Quite depressing. So a whole lot that you've shared with us around these structural reforms that need to take place. So I've got two questions around that. One is, what kinds of structural reforms have actually worked in reducing inequality in African countries? So where are the points of light, even if it's on a small scale? And then also around structural transformation, what would be clear indicators that we need to be tracking? Are we tracking the right things? Thank you. It's around indicators for structural transformation that will make it clear for us, for Africa, that we are on the right track. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Go.
Thank you. I particularly like the lens that you've taken on inequality, looking at it from an expenditure investment perspective and a government operations perspective. Really interesting, and both have very different ways of addressing them. The thing that I'm finding interesting at the moment is, in a highly constrained public fiscal space, what do you see as the role of national development banks or public development banks to play in investing in social infrastructure? Because those growth drivers that you talked about, education, healthcare, are part of the social investment sectors, but they're not going to come out of the fiscal purse. And how can financial inclusion policy, if at all, be leveraged? A lot of countries have national development banks, and I don't think we're seeing that. We're seeing it from an investment perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you. Prof, thank you for for your input on this important topic. One of the things that I find puzzling consistently, we all know the role of elites in a society, the disproportionate amount of influence they have on whatever happens. I just want to find out from you, to what extent can we point to the complicity of African intellectuals in addressing this matter? For all of these decades, we are gathered here as economists, we'll flash graphs and that, but the behavior of political elites, private sector elites, and indeed African intellectuals themselves point to one simple fact. The elites do not think it matters enough. Is it something that you can reflect on, Prof? To what extent do African elites believe that this inequality poses no risk whatsoever to themselves? Because if you've got a majority of poor people that are suffering, we write papers, we theorize about this, but deep down we know it won't really affect us as elites. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all for very interesting questions and viewpoints. What kind of structural reforms have worked? And there are not many in Africa that one can use as examples of, I've seen countries that are interested in ensuring that there's a more equal access to land, as in Ethiopia, before the last season. So that, and it worked. It worked especially in urban areas. It worked partially in the rural areas. But you could see a strong desire to create access for everybody. So it was well intended, and it yielded some positive results. Another example that I think about is Rwanda, that has pursued structural reforms that have been designed to diversify the economy and also provide some social cover for a larger. And I've seen, but and many of my colleagues have argued that look, Rwanda is a very small country, so it's easy for these things to happen. Ghana, again, Ghana benefited a lot from structural reforms in the 80s, but it wasn't sustained and it wasn't well managed. We pursued reforms initially as simply policy reforms in the trade sector, policy reforms in financial sector, and policy reforms in the management of the public services. It was much later that we added the social dimension and then developed what we call the policy actions to mitigate the social costs of adjustment. It was an add-on. After we had changed the way we funded health and we had changed the way we funded education, we provided these social remedies to deal with the costs of adjustment. It was a little bit too late. But Ghana came back and took the lead in social protection. Long before many African governments were thinking about cash transfer, Ghana was doing that. Not with donor funds, well, with Ghana government funds, But I've written about it. I've said we did the right thing for the wrong reasons. We did it for political convenience. It brought votes, and the politicians could see that this is a vote winner, and so they did it. You see, so there, and that takes me to the point that our colleague made there about the role of intellectuals. The African intellectual is like any other African. We live in an environment that you need to do something for yourself in order to survive. If going into politics is the way to survive, then you do it. So you will find in many countries people that were, during their academic careers, very vociferous in expressing the misgivings that they have about policy, and as soon as they got into politics, their views changed. Is that representative of the African intellectual? I don't think so. But we are products of our environment. You can't live in an environment that is very, very unequal. Yes, as I'm doing, you can talk about it. You can provide suggestions, but you're not the person going to, you're not going to give up your salary because, so we do that. So my point is, since we are, the most we can do is partner with civil society. And I've seen in many, many countries, initiatives led by civil society that have intellectuals as partners. That is most effective. I've seen NGOs in many parts of West Africa, East Africa, that are leading campaigns for more equality, whether it's on gender lines or spatial lines. The NGOs are doing it. And many of the intellectuals who are minded to support that have worked with these NGOs. It takes me to a question that was asked earlier about what is the African University doing? The African University can empower these NGOs, and can empower civil society. African universities can talk and should talk about these things. African universities are in a unique position that in many countries that they are the only independent sources of information. They are the only, so that gives them a lot of moral authority. So Governments everywhere would like to silence universities, and they try to. Governments everywhere would like to do that. And the only reason why they want to do it is to silence, to ensure that when they do their rogue things, there's no one to hold them to account. So I think universities need to fight for their independence, hold on to that independence, and use it to empower poorer groups, use it to support civil society, use it to hold governments to account. That is what you're going to do and has to be done. There was the question of national development banks. And as you rightly point out, they are not new. They've been with us really from the early days of independence. We saw national development banks as essential for doing what commercial banks had not done. Commercial banks were lending to the mining companies and multinational firms that were involved in trade. Nobody gave any hook about agriculture. And so we set up development banks that would take care of agriculture. We set up development banks that would take care of housing for investment and so on. We did that. But we politicized them. So they were a national bank. So in Ghana, we had the Agricultural Development Bank. And the people who got the loans from the Agricultural Development Bank were the people who were related to the politicians and the chiefs and so on. So it wasn't surprising when we ran the bank aground. We had a national investment bank, what that was supposed to take care of the long-term finance needs of our industry. Again, it was overly politicized. You politicize a bank by making the Minister of Finance responsible for appointing the managing director. You politicize a bank by having board members who are all beholden to a political party or to some state institution. When you put these kinds of entities into managing a national development bank, they simply become instruments for pursuing government agenda in the districts and in the regions, and so they will not survive because all that they and I haven't seen any in any country. But it doesn't mean that the case for having these development is gone. No, we still have economies where agriculture still does not receive the kind of lending that it requires. So because the commercial banks or universal banks are not doing it. So who is going to do it? We need new development banks, not the type that are being pushed by the World Bank, not the type that are being pushed by various development partners. Africans have to sit back and say, what kind of development bank that is independent enough to support manufacturing or to support agriculture or to support the services sector? What kind of independence do they need? What kind of skills? The link to microfinance, for example, is a very strong one, or should be a very strong one, because microfinance can be supported not necessarily through the national initiatives, but through these larger banks. I've always believed in having an integrated financial system where the small entities are linked to the larger ones, so they are able to share risk across board. And that's what we need to do when we think about national debt. There is a strong argument, still strong argument, for having national development banks. But if we turn them into political banks, they will run bankrupt again.
Right. So I'm aware that there's still a large number of you that would have liked to ask questions, but I want to be respectful to kind of everyone's time and kind of end the event on time. I also realize that I'm standing between you and a drink, so I should really kind of keep this short. So kind of really apologies to kind of all of those who had their hands up and who haven't had the opportunity to kind of ask a question. So I have to do a few thank yous. So a really sort of special thank you to the SCIS operations team, who have done all of the work to make it possible for us to have the lecture, kind of the lecture today. So you know who you all are. kind of really, really grateful for kind of all of the support. To all of my research colleagues in kind of in the center who help us to frame these kind of lectures. Thank you for kind of all of your support. Our kind of media partner for this event and a number of our other events at kind of SCIS is the Conversation. So thank you so much to the Conversation for all of your support. I can really want to acknowledge the support of our dean, Prof. Cohen is kind of here with us this evening. Thank you so much for attending, and also for kind of all of the support that you provide to the faculty and to all of the research centers, including SCIS. Thank you so much, Jason. To our DVC for Research, Lynn, thank you for the leadership that you provide that make it possible for all of the research centers at WITS to thrive. I think without your leadership, we wouldn't achieve half of what we do. So thank you so much. I then want to thank you all for kind of attending tonight, and then a special thank you to Prof. Aryeetey for kind of traveling from kind of all the way from Accra, and for sharing his thoughts on kind of on these issues. I think my takeaway from the talk this evening is that as kind of Africans, we kind of often look to others to provide solutions for the problems that we have to deal with. I can't think that the Chinese would kind of ever have brought in a whole lot of consultants from kind of outside. They kind of design their own strategies, and I think the kind of the message from Prof. Aryeetey is that really this kind of issue is in our hands, and I think it's all of our responsibility to work on it. So Prof. Aryeetey will join us for some drinks, which we'd like to invite you all, invite you all to join us for, and there'll be a bit more time there to chat with him and to kind of chat among yourselves. So kind of thank you again, and please join us for some snacks and drinks.